is Cece Doucette from Ashland, and we're here at the Burlington Public Library to discuss 5G and the Internet of Things and the impact that that may have on our communities and on our health. So I had been the president of the Ashland Education Foundation a while back, and in that role I kept hearing about the 21st century classroom and how all of our children needed to have all this experience with wireless devices and technology in the classrooms. And Ashland is a very little school district. We don't have much of a budget for this sort of thing. So I jumped in and started doing fundraising to bring all this technology into our schools, the iPads, the Chromebooks, the Wi-Fi systems. And then a while later, a girlfriend of mine who's an electrical engineer tipped me off that there could be something up with Wi-Fi and health. And it was at book group, so I just kind of made a mental note of it. But then I read something about it not long after, and I thought, wow, if there's anything to this, I would like to know. So I went to my IT director at Ashland Public Schools and said, you know, what do you know about wireless being harmful? And he and I had worked on all these campaigns together, and he said, never heard of it, let me go check. And he came back and said, the FCC says it's fine. But I'm a technical and professional writer by trade, so part of my skill set is doing research. So I had already begun to do a deeper dive. And if you do a search and put in, is Wi-Fi safe, you will indeed come up with studies that were done under conditions that showed no harm. But if you get past those industry-funded studies, there's a lot more to the story, and that's what I'm here to share with you tonight. And I will spend probably about a half hour to 40 minutes presenting information. I would ask that you please hold your questions to the end to make sure we get through the information, and then we'll have 15 or 20 minutes to go through questions and answers. Does anybody here have an iPhone with you tonight? Alrighty. Do me a favor, take that out, and I want to show you something in there. And for those who have a different type of phone, you will find the same type of information in your user manual or sometimes embedded into your phone itself. So go ahead and go into settings. Okay, and if others want to look in on what we're doing here, that would be fine too. So from settings, scroll down just a little ways to general. And remember the acronym GAL, like this gal at the library showed me where this is in my phone, right? So G is for general, hit that, and then scroll down a little ways to, up at the top is about, and then scroll down all the way to the bottom, and you will find legal. So GAL, general about legal, and at the bottom of legal, you will see RF exposure. That's radio frequency radiation, and another name for that is microwave radiation. And what that legal fine print buried in the phone tells us is keep this device X amount of distance from your body, or you may exceed the FCC limits for public radiation exposure. It also says to use a hands-free option like speakerphone. Otherwise, just by holding that device in active mode, you may be exceeding the FCC limits for public radiation exposure. So from settings, you go to general, and then about, and then legal. All the way down is legal. And then RF exposure is at the bottom of legal. You got it? Okay. So I would ask everybody tonight, out of consideration for those who don't wish to be exposed to microwave radiation, please put all of your devices into airplane mode. That would include any other cell phones, any iPads, any wearables. Whatever you have that is wireless is sending data back and forth using microwave radiation. And as we'll discuss tonight, the peer-reviewed published scientific literature shows this is very biologically hazardous. So when I was first learning about this, I learned that if you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, in the microwave section, we have things like cell towers, cell phones, utility smart meters, Wi-Fi, microwave ovens, baby monitors, the DECT, the digital electronic cordless phones, and radar. And so what we're here to think about tonight is what does it mean if our community is getting applications from the telecom industry to put 5G or small cell or distributed antenna systems inside our neighborhoods every 2 to 12 houses. Those signals are also in the microwave section. Okay, so as I was learning about this, I found something when I did my investigation called the Bioinitiative Report. And this is a compendium of the studies that have been done all the way now through 2017. This was a 2014 summary for the public that was released. And then subsequent to that, Dr. Henry Lai has incorporated additional research that's been done since then. And if you go to the Bioinitiative Report online, you can actually look at the thousands upon thousands of studies that we have throughout the world that show biological effects. And the actual report is like, I don't know, 1,600 pages. So I've just brought the cover so you get a visual and the table of contents. And I'll read you a summary of the key scientific evidence. Evidence for sperm and reproduction damage. And these are the studies that got me on my feet, because they've taken male human sperm, exposed it to a laptop with the antennas on, it changed the DNA, which is the roadmap to grow a proper human. It slowed the motility and caused far fewer sperm to be viable in just 4 hours of exposure. And back in 2013, when I discovered this, I had just given my daughter a laptop. And she was a high school student, and of course, where is she using it but right on top of her reproductive system? So we figured out how to remediate that. So evidence that children are more vulnerable. They're not just little adults. Their central nervous system is still developing. Their immune system is still developing. Their very DNA is still developing. And the scientific studies show that this is damaging DNA. And it's also hitting the immune and the central nervous systems especially hard. If you look at a child's head, their skull is thinner, their brain has a higher water content, and they are physiologically absorbing more radiation than you and I, and it's not good for us. So if you were to hold a cell phone up to an adult head, you would see in the scientific literature that the signal is going through about this much of your head. On a 10-year-old, it's going through about this much of the head, and on a 5-year-old, it's going almost all the way across the brain. So evidence that children are more vulnerable, evidence for fetal and neonatal effects, because we have this beautiful life form forming here that's especially vulnerable. We know from lead studies and so forth that we need to especially protect that growing brain in there. And now we have moms just putting the iPad or the phone right here. I spoke to a doctor who did rounds during both her pregnancies, and she carried her cell phone right here. Both of her children are now electrically sensitive. Evidence for effects on autism. Dr. Martha Herbert runs the autism lab at Mass General Hospital, and she sees huge correlations between the families that she services and what we know happens with microwave radiation. And just as importantly, she sees that when you remove microwave radiation from a child's environment, oftentimes they begin to recover some of the skills that they weren't able to develop with this constant bombardment of microwave radiation. Evidence of electrohypersensitivity, or EHS, or electrical sensitivity. This is when our bodies begin to feel the effects of this constant pulsing of microwave radiation. Welcome. Common symptoms that people begin to feel when they start getting effects from wireless radiation. A big one is insomnia, that people aren't sleeping properly anymore. Turn everything off for the next 3 nights and see what happens. You might be really pleasantly surprised. Headaches, stabbing headaches, dizziness, nausea. Oftentimes the headaches progress to headaches and nosebleeds. Anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, cognitive impairment, memory issues, and more. And this is what the published, peer-reviewed science is showing us. Effects from cell tower radiofrequency exposures, evidence for effects on the blood-brain barrier. There are studies that show that we have these barriers or membranes in our body to protect sensitive areas from toxins going through. We know scientifically that wireless radiation can open the blood-brain barrier, which allows toxins that are flowing through the bloodstream to go into sensitive tissues that they've never been before. And when you look around at our children today and many adults, we have never seen the levels of social and emotional issues that people are being hospitalized for today. Even the wee little ones, all the way up through the high schools. It's becoming one of the biggest issues that our schools are confronted with today. Evidence for genotoxicity, evidence for neurotoxicity because it hits that nervous system, evidence for effects on cancer, not only childhood leukemia, but adult cancers too, melatonin depletion, breast cancer, and Alzheimer's disease. We are seeing a lot earlier onset of Alzheimer's. We're seeing breast cancers in men and women. Girls, women often stick their cell phones in their bras. And we have a case study in the film Generation Zapped, which I highly recommend everybody watch, where she had been storing her cell phone inside of her bra. She didn't have any family history, she didn't have any genetic history or her race, and yet she had multiple tumors in the places where the antennas are in her cell phone. We also see breast cancers increasing in men who's put these in their shirt pockets or their suit pockets. And then we see big impacts on our body's stress responses, the stress proteins and DNA as a fractal antenna. And so this is what the scientific literature is saying. So when Ashland Public Schools saw this, and they also saw studies that were done by industry that showed no evidence of harm. We, of course, didn't know those were industry-funded studies at the time. They didn't know what to do, and this became a challenging conversation back in 2013. But when Ashland Public Schools read that fine print that some of you looked at tonight that says, keep this device off your body or you're going to exceed the FCC limits for public radiation exposure, that's when they had a legal uh-oh moment. And so Ashland Public Schools, I learned later, became the first in the nation to even have this sign laminated and hanging in our classrooms right here in Ashland, Massachusetts. So turn off the device when not in use. But the industry gives us everything, all Wi-Fi all the time. We think it's great. But that one device that you guys have with you tonight, that cell phone, has 5 or 6 separate antennas that are constantly pulsing microwave radiation to make a handshake with the nearest cell tower or router. It's got a cellular antenna, a data antenna, a Wi-Fi antenna, a Bluetooth antenna, a locator antenna, and by now a hotspot because the industry is using us as their network to throw signal far and wide. Without knowing that, we all just stick them in our pockets. Colon cancers, rectal cancers, doubling and quadrupling now in our young adults. And it's no coincidence. They're storing their devices, they're using their devices there in full power with all these antennas radiating, having no idea that our cells feel what's going on there. So Ashland Public Schools became the first in the nation to even do this. And then as I dug a little bit deeper, I learned how it is that the industry brought this to market. They did it with no safety testing. This is SAM, Specific Anthropomorphic Mannequin, in the 90th percentile of military fitness, 6'2", 220-pound male with water-based gel in his head. And what they did is they put a phone near Sam's head, attached to a probe, put that probe in Sam's head and said, how much heat might it take to raise the temperature of that gel in Sam's head? And that was it. They never even tested for non-thermal effects. And yet we have scientific studies done by our military, done by other places. Actually, I have one here that was done by the parent company of T-Mobile back in the year 2000. It was commissioned by the German parent company, and when they saw what the scientists were telling them, it never saw the light of day, and we never heard. Worse, the industry did their own studies back in the 1990s, and when their scientists said, yes, this does look to be carcinogenic, and children are more vulnerable, the industry pushed to get the Telecom Act passed. which gave them the right to say, we're going to go put cell towers in, and if your municipality or any of your residents or business owners don't like where we're putting them, well, you're just out of luck, because it all rolls up to that Telecom Act of 1996. So when I was discussing this with my schools back in 2013, I kept thinking, surely somebody's got our back on this, right? And it wasn't until 2015 that that missing piece came into focus for me. And that was when Harvard University's Law School Center for Ethics put out this 59-page report called Captured Agency, how the FCC is dominated by the industries it presumably regulates. And in that, I got to see what the industry had done, how they had done their own studies back in the day, how they suppressed that evidence of harm and failed to invoke the precautionary principle, and how they're deploying basically the tobacco playbook. Because with the big tobacco playbook, what they encourage big companies to do, suppress evidence of harm, and they're very effective at doing that because they control primarily what gets reported out in our news. When you turn on your radio tonight, when you look at your TV, you're going to see Sprint, Verizon, AT&T, Comcast. You're going to hear it on your radio, more Wi-Fi, throw that signal all the way across your house, buy more stuff to do that. And it's all being kept from the public. So that was 2015. In 2018, well, let me back up to 2016. The U.S. National Toxicology Program, which is a part of the National Institutes for Health here and the National Institutes of Environmental Health and Sciences, about a decade ago, the FDA commissioned a study with them, expecting that they would go in and prove that cell phones were safe. And remember, a decade ago, cell phones were the technology of the day, right? So they set up this very big study. It was a $25 million study. And first they went in to see, okay, at what level does that heat thing kick in? And then they did the rest of the studies at the non-thermal level. So you can't say that it's the heat that's causing the harm, right? So in 2016, they did the very first set of analysis on that study, and they found statistically significant DNA damage, brain tumors, and heart tumors. They told the FDA, they told the FCC, and they tried to tell the public, but you and I know we never heard that in mainstream media. The FCC, within 3 weeks of hearing that, pushed and got approval for 5G spectrum so that they can start putting in infrastructure in our towns for 5G cell towers to connect everything to the internet through Internet of Things, right? So once again, instead of invoking the precautionary principle, they pushed and got approval to start moving forward with 5G. So they knew that the National Toxicology Program needed to finish up the other 3/4 of their analysis, and that was done this year. In the winter, the rest of that study was completed, and in the spring, there was an unprecedented 3-day peer review of those findings of the National Toxicology Program. That was held down at the NIH. There were world scientists from all over who came into public comment on that one. And at the end of that 3-day review, the NTP voted that this is a clear carcinogen. And that's where we are today. Some people will say that, oh, you know, that's only one study. You need to have other studies that will show the same thing. Well, right on the heels of the NTP study coming out, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy, which is a cancer institute, just wrapped up another very large study that found DNA damage, brain tumors, heart tumors, and more. So as far as our industry has spun this for the last few decades, we now have, even within our own country, which is not really funding much research anymore on this, we have solid scientific evidence of harm. And right on the heels of that NTP study coming out, The Nation, which I understand is our country's oldest magazine, it's an independent journalism magazine, they put out an investigative report called How Big Wireless Made Us Think That Cell Phones Are Safe, a special investigation. And this harkens back to the 1990s when the industry did their own studies, found it to be cancerous, and suppressed evidence of harm. So that came out this year too. And one of the ways that we actually set our FCC guidelines, we don't even have standards around this in this country, but the FCC guidelines that we set years ago allow this much radiation. And all of this peer-reviewed published science is showing biological effects way down here at hundreds of thousands of times below what the industry is still allowed to put out there for us. Something that I found very important is that right after these studies came out this year in 2018, the IEEE, which is the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers, they are one of the bodies that helped to form those FCC limits way back up here based on thermal effects, back in the 90s based on microwave oven studies that were done in the 70s and 80s. This fall, the IEEE Microwave Magazine in the September-October 2018 edition has an article called Clear Evidence of Cell Phone Radio Frequency Radiation Cancer Risk. So even the engineers who helped to set up those guidelines that were not even obsolete, they were never proven safe, they were never effective, never tested for children, for fetuses, for the elderly, for anybody with an existing health compromise. Those are all very vulnerable subpopulations to microwave radiation, let alone those of us who are able to say we're somewhat healthy today. So even the IEEE is conceding that this is biologically active. So another big secret that the industry would rather we don't know, and this is important for those who work for our municipalities, is that the main insurers have already, years ago, identified radio frequency radiation as a leading risk. Lloyd's of London, for example, already has exclusion 32 in their policies to say we do not insure for microwave radiation because there's such a high risk. Swiss Re as well has acknowledged that. So when these companies come in, put in applications, get applications approved, the towns by and large sign off saying we accept responsibility for that. So when those poles come down, when a car crashes into a pole, it comes down, when a fire starts, that's now all on the town because the industry has no insurance coverage. And our towns may not even have insurance coverage if we don't know to look for those exclusions in the policies. So in the legal arena, some of you may be familiar with the Faith School in Southborough. It's the younger grade feeder school into St. Mark's, and these are very prestigious private boarding schools, international, where like Saudi princes would send their sons to be educated, right here in Southborough. There was a little boy who kept winding up in the nurse's office complaining of these headaches that eventually came on with nosebleeds, dizziness, nausea, brain fog, really couldn't focus on his studies. Mom and Dad would come get him from school, take him to the doctor would run the tests they know to run, and they just kept coming up empty. And he was a great kid, well-adjusted, happy, friends, sports, whatever, great kid, but kept getting sick. And then they noticed, and this went on for a couple of years, then they started noticing when he was home on school break or home for summer vacation, all those symptoms abated. And then within a day or two of being back in the Faith School, he just got walloped all over again. So they started saying, well, what can this be? And they started researching his symptoms on their own. And that's where they discovered electrical sensitivities. And they recognized that most doctors have never been trained on microwave illnesses, but environmental health doctors have been trained on this. And in fact, in 2013, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine put out a position statement to the United States school superintendents to say our schools should only be using hardwired technology and children should not be exposed to wireless radiation. So if you are fortunate to get a hold of an environmental health medicine doctor, there are a few here in Massachusetts, then they can properly run the test to test for microwave radiation toxicity. So this family was able to finally get a doctor's diagnosis. They brought that back to the Faith School and said, could we please ask for accommodations to just hardwire the classrooms that our son is going to need to be in this year. And they were turned down. I understand that that administrator has a wait list internationally a mile long and is not prone to continue to enroll families that raise issues. So they hooked the child up with a dosimeter, which is a medical device that doctors wear when they're administering treatments that involve microwave radiation. Like, it's great to use for stem cell growth, for bone cell growth in a controlled medical situation. So they hooked him up with a dosimeter to measure what his biological symptoms were experiencing, and then they outfitted him with a high-end professional grade radiofrequency radiation detection meter that could record the exposures throughout the day. And at the end of the day, this heart monitor and the RF meter measurements went like this in parallel throughout the day. So wherever there were high radio frequencies, his little heart was struggling to keep up. So they went back and said, okay, now we have evidence. Can you please look at this data? And could we please ask for accommodation so our son can access his education? And once again, they were turned down. They came back a third time and said, well, we're fortunate to have the financial means. Could we please pay out of pocket to hardwire the 10 classrooms that our now 7th grade son is going to need to be in? And once again, the administrator was not interested in offering accommodations. And under the Americans with Disabilities Act, every child, regardless of public or private schooling, every child on American soil is entitled to reasonable access. So this family has a lawsuit against the Fay School in Southborough, and it has already been, I don't know the formal terms, but they brought in the expert witnesses, and when the judge heard what the peer-reviewed, published, non-industry funded science showed, they acknowledged that yes, there are biological effects at the non-thermal level. And that's critical because this is the first time in a US court that the judge has recognized the non-thermal effect. So that lawsuit is still underway in the Fay School. And there are other court cases that have already been won around the world. This one is in an Italian court that granted Social Security benefits to somebody who had become ill from this one was actually very ironic. It was an employee for a telecom company that was made to use his cell phone for conference calls, and he wound up getting the tumors in his head. So they awarded for him. There was another woman in Grenoble, France, who became ill from her utility smart meter, and she was also awarded damages for that. There have been cases in Spain and elsewhere around the world. So it's very sad to me that it takes legal action to do the right thing, to get the information to the public, and to start taking action to preventatively protect our citizens. So I met with my senator, Senator Karen Spilka, after Ashland put up that sign in the schools, and I said, is there a way that you can think of to get this information out to the public? Because I had already spoken to our Board of Selectmen. They had no idea this issue existed. I spoke with our health agent. He had no idea this issue existed, but he was gracious enough back in 2013 to reach out to the Department of Public Health, who was a little fuzzy on this too. They reached out to a colleague in Canada who sent back something that said, even though the World Health Organization classified all forms of radiofrequency radiation as a Group 2B possible human carcinogen in 2011, that's the same category that coffee and pickled vegetables are in, so you don't need to worry. And by then I had heard that industry spin. And what that was is, yes, coffee was on the Group 2B list because of the chemicals that were being used in the ground to grow that coffee. It has since been cleaned up and removed from the list. The pickled vegetables was a form of formaldehyde that was used in pickling those vegetables, and certain Asian populations that ate those in quantity wound up getting cancers from those pickled vegetables. So those two aside, also in the Group 2B category are lead, thalidomide, chloroform, DDT, and a whole host of other chemicals that I can't even pronounce, that we have safety precautions around. But we are at a certain point in time today where we're still on this all Wi-Fi all the time honeymoon, and we have no safety precautions around that. So I went and met with Senator Karen Spilka, and I went to our local coffee hours in Ashland, and I explained to her what the scientific evidence was, and then I measured her cell phone and her district director's laptop. And when I did, it went way into the red zone and off the charts. And this is about a $400 radio frequency radiation detection device called an Acoustic Meatus. And so Senator Spilka was looking at me like, really? And I'm like, yes, and nobody knows. I said, is there anything in your wheelhouse that you can suggest to just give people the right to know? Tobacco, alcohol, gambling, pornography, cigarettes. Adults will make their choices, but everybody should have the right to know this is extremely toxic, and it's our moral obligation to protect our children. So Senator Spilka said yes, and she put me in touch with a lawyer in her office, and this was last session, 2015-16. And together we crafted a very simple bill to get the right bright minds together at the state level to start addressing this. And so I was told, don't get your hopes up, a bill almost never goes anywhere the first session it's introduced, and others would say if it comes in by constituent request, that's like a red flag to our legislators that, amidst the thousands of bills they have to get through in a session, maybe they don't need to pay attention to this one. I said, okay, but it's better than what we started with, right? So on this journey, I've had the privilege of reaching out and hearing back from many of the world's leading scientists, doctors who are experts in this, public health, policy people who understand this, people all over Massachusetts who have become ill from this, loved ones of people who have died from those glioblastomas. John McCain, left-handed, glioblastoma right here. He had also had a bunch of other tumors removed from this area. Ted Kennedy, our own beloved senator, right-handed, glioblastoma, and his family believes it had to do with his cell phone. So I was very fortunate to be in touch with so many world experts, and when my bill came up for public hearing, I was told you get 3 minutes to testify. And I thought, okay, that's not a lot, right? So by then I had networked with some other people in Massachusetts, and a number of us went in and testified in person. But I created a little template and reached out to the real experts and said, would you be so kind as to send in a statement of support for this bill and show them the studies, right? So we had a lot of testimony that came in. And as I was testifying at the State House in my 3 minutes, I'm holding up, the fine print, I'm holding up the bioinitiative report, I'm holding up Ashland's best practices, I'm holding up my meter, and I'm showing how much radiation is in the room. And as I'm doing this, I'm watching the faces of the Joint Committee on Public Health, and I could tell that not one single person had any idea this issue even existed. And I thought, okay, that's not really enough time to fully help them engage in this conversation. So I spent the next 6 to 9 months making appointments, traveling into the State House, and one by one educated the offices of every member on that committee. And by some miracle, they reported my bill out favorably the first time it was introduced. And I thought, well, that sounds really good. Now what? Well, then it got bundled with like 50 other bills into a lot. That lot was sent over to the Joint Committee on Healthcare Financing, and it was sent to study. And I was like, oh, well, that's a bummer. So I went back to Senator Spilka's office and said, okay, now what? And they said, come back in the fall of 2017 as we're preparing for the next session, and Senator Spilka will assess what's coming out of her district, and she'll decide what to do then. I said, okay. So he said, but you should feel really good because this almost never happens that you even get it out under your own name. And I went, all right, but we haven't really helped anybody yet. So I went back in the fall of 17. He said, oh yeah, we just met on this. Let me look. And he said, oh yeah, she is going to bring that bill back, and this time she's going to sponsor it directly. And I thought that was pretty nice. And I found out from others later that Senator Spilka does not introduce very much legislation because she had been our chairwoman of the Senate Ways and Means Committee before she just got voted in as our Senate president, and she is by the law. So she wasn't doing me a favor, she was doing her job. And then when that much evidence came through, she saw fit to introduce it under her own name. So we started off this session with my bill, Senate Bill 1268, which is now sponsored directly by Senator Karen Spilka. Senator Michael Moore is out of Worcester. And in true environmental justice fashion, these big toxic companies will come into a community that's predominantly underprivileged and roll out their toxic product and then say, hey, look, it worked great here. Now we're going to roll it out all across the state. And that's what National Grid is doing out in Worcester right now with the Utility Smart Grid program, where they're putting microwave radiation emitting smart meters for electrical on everybody's house. They're taking off the old analog meters with the little dials on them, which lasted 30 or 40 years, and now they're putting these on. The problem with that is you have a choice with everything you've brought into your home, your router, your cell phone, your baby monitor, your gaming devices. All of that, you get to choose if or when you want any radiation. Most people who learn about this will go home and hardwire everything with an Ethernet cable and then just turn all those antennas off, and you'll get a much faster connection. Your signal is more reliable, and your data is a lot safer, and you're not emitting microwave radiation at yourself and your loved ones. But when they impose a utility smart meter on your house, then you have no control, and that device is pulsing microwave radiation 24/7 all through your house at you or your loved ones. They have no regard for whether there's a pregnant woman on the other side of that wall, a senior citizen, a child, or somebody whose body is already fighting off some chronic illness. They just stick those on and off they go. And when I talked to my town about this and I said, well, what is the smart grid and are we on it? They said, no, in Ashland, we have not gone on the smart grid, but we have started converting out a lot of our analog meters to digital meters. And from a financial perspective, you could see why, because now instead of paying a walker to get the reading from your meter every month, they can now pay someone to drive by in a truck, point their device at your device, get a reading, and keep going. So I can definitely see why it would be a cost save for our municipalities, but not at the expense of our health and our children's health. So National Grid is out there. They have gone way over budget. I was fortunate recently to go to the Department of Public Utilities, and they gave me a full hour to testify. There's another woman, Patricia Burke, who has followed all of the fraudulent things that have gone on with that smart meter program out there, and she testified to that. So this is all out online. If anybody just put Cece Doucette, DPU, you'll find that testimony out there. So Senator Moore had a bill to give people the right to choose throughout Massachusetts not to have that utility meter imposed on us. That's a great first step. We shouldn't even be allowing that into our state because it's so toxic. So my bill was Senator Spilka, Senator Moore's bill, and then I understood that Representative Linsky, who has Natick in his district, has another bill that is impacted by man-made radiation, and that's for the high voltage power lines that are in an area of Natick where there's a large cancer cluster. So we started this session with 3 bills, and then Senator Julian Cyr out of the Cape and the Islands used to be the Department of Public Health liaison to the Massachusetts State House. He introduced two bills to give people the right to know what that fine print says, because you should be notified at the point of sale. You should have labeling like we ultimately did with cigarettes that says, don't give this to a child, right? This is microwave radiation. Don't put this on your body. This is microwave radiation. So we should have labeling. We should have point of purchase signs. We should have protections in place for all of us. So now we have 5 bills, and then I find out that Representative Carolyn Dykema, who has the FACE school in her district, she found out about Ashland's best practices for mobile devices. So Representative Dykema introduced a bill to get the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to examine this issue and start protecting all of our children and staffs in the schools. And then, so we had like 5 bills at that point, 6 bills now, and then 2 more bills popped up a couple months later. There's a teacher out in Western Massachusetts who had the misfortune of having her classroom right next to one of the main control rooms in her high school, where this whole field of electromagnetic radiation was just bombarding her day in and day out, and she got very sick from it. She can't even teach anymore because she can't go back into an area that has high electromagnetic fields. So she went to Senator Donald Humison and explained this issue, and of course he had no idea because nobody's ever heard of this because it's so suppressed in the media. But Senator Humison let her write 2 bills, 1, to get this stuff out of our schools, and 2, to get the medical community trained and to get insurance to cover treatment for this, because when you get sick from this, your doctors don't know what's going on, so you wind up going to specialists, and now you're paying out of pocket. They can't figure it out. Now you spent thousands of dollars, so now you start going to alternative healers. Finally, one of them will tell you, you are electrically sensitive, and then they will teach them what you need to do to remediate your home and have safe technology. But oftentimes, this is a cumulative effect, and the damage is cumulative. Sometimes you're lucky enough to be able to remediate, and then you regain your health again. Other times, you're not that lucky. And for people who would say, oh, well, I feel fine, I don't feel anything. We don't feel cancer coming on. We don't feel infertility coming on. We don't see DNA damage coming on in our children until they're symptomatic of it. So we then had 8 bills in the Massachusetts legislature, and we are totally leading the nation with these bills. When the Joint Committee on Consumer Protection was assigned those 2 bills from Senator Sear to give people the right to know, they got all this testimony that came in. We came in and testified. And as luck would have it, when I put out the call to action to our experts, one of them reached back to me, Dr. Martin Paul, who's a professor emeritus of Washington State University, and he's done the analysis on this and can tell you study for study what's going on here. He said, hey, I'm going to be in Boston. I'm going to be on the East Coast because I'm going to be lecturing about this at Yale, and then I'm going over to Spain to lecture. But before I go, I'm coming to visit my old college roommate in Boston. Can I help you with anything? And the very day that Dr. Martin Paul was in Boston was the day that 2 of these bills were up for hearing, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon. So Dr. Paul came as a world-leading expert and testified on these bills too. So the Joint Committee on Consumer Protection was supposed to report out on their bill by February. They actually filed for an extension, so they assigned a research analyst to do this, to do the deep dive on this. And at the end of that analysis, they wrote their own bill to say, we want to form a commission to get the right bright minds together at the state, and let's get the industry to the table, because let's hammer this out once and for all. So now we have 9 bills in Massachusetts for this issue that nobody's ever heard of, right? So some of those bills have already been sent to study, but 5 of them are still alive. We have until December 31st to hopefully get through the elections first, and then bring our attention back to this and see if we can start getting some protections in place for the public. But in the meantime, I understand that Verizon has submitted a number of applications in Burlington to start installing small cell antennas, otherwise known as distributed antenna systems. And don't make any mistakes in thinking that just because the industry is calling them small, that their effects are small. These are millimeter waves, which our military uses for crowd control because they know that they can zap people with them and get things moving. We have little antennas in our skin that are especially sensitive to millimeter waves. Our eyes, the science is showing, are especially sensitive to millimeter waves. And it's not like they're just going to put in their 5G infrastructure and take down everything else. They've already maxed out their profitability on the 3rd generation and 4th generation segment of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum. So in order to keep innovating, they now want to use the crummy end of the spectrum with these 5G millimeter waves. But 5G waves are so small, they promise vast quantities of data, faster streaming, but they can't carry it very far. So the industry's solution is to add a whole nother layer of infrastructure, and not 300 feet up in the air in an industrial park. They want to be able to put cell antennas inside our neighborhoods, every 2 to 12 houses, on street-level poles in the public access right-of-way. We're the public. And I'm telling you, I don't want that anywhere near my neighborhood. So the industry, like they did with the cell tower infrastructure back in the 90s, is up in DC right now trying to push through a Streamline Act that would take away home rule rights from our local municipalities to say if or where we even want this technology. They want to remove any barriers, and that means taking away home rule rights. But once we know about this, folks are not taking this sitting down. There's a statement by the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and they are saying that we are fighting against this. And they're even threatening to sue the FCC and the industry if they think they're going to come into our neighborhoods and start putting this in. Out in California, Mill Valley, which is near Silicon Valley, they've already acted proactively to say we are not letting this into our community. So for those of you who may work for our town, follow these examples. Investigate, look to protect your citizens as fast as you can, because they have no right to put this technology in here, knowing what the science is showing, knowing that the National Toxicology Program is putting out a report this fall that says DNA damage, brain tumors, heart tumors, and more, and other huge bodies of science that show infertility, children are especially vulnerable, Alzheimer's, early onset cancers. Why on earth would we do this to our own population? So, Dr. Deborah Davis, who heads up the Environmental Health Trust, she's a Nobel Peace Prize co-laureate on the team that won the Nobel Prize for climate change. She is all over this issue. She has founded a nonprofit called the Environmental Health Trust, and she brought a panel of experts to the Massachusetts legislature in 2015 asking for the right to know. She has a great fact sheet, says what you need to know about 5G wireless and small cells, so you can go out to the Environmental Health Trust and see the science. But even if, because the FCC has put this clause, Section 704 in the Telecom Act saying you can't claim any harm from health, there's so much more to this story. So there is, it's actually this policy book from the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy in Washington, D.C., with a PhD, Dr. Timothy Sheckly. He has documented all the reasons why Wi-Fi is just a really poor choice, and certainly investing in any more wireless in our communities is not sustainable. We were promised that the industry would bring fiber to the premises. They've laid a lot of that fiber cabling already, but then they stopped, realizing that it's much more profitable to put in all the wireless at the endpoint. So that's why they want to keep putting all these cell tower antennas, now even closer, right outside of our bedrooms, because it's cheaper and highly more profitable. But it's crummy technology. You all know that you don't get a good signal all the time on your cell phone. You know if you're using it in your house, the signal comes and goes. Hardwire it right to the premises, and then run Ethernet cables inside your home. If you use an iPad or an iPhone, you can buy a little adapter. Plug it into your Ethernet cable, into your router on one end. Plug this into this and into your device. You've got perfectly safe technology once you go in and turn off those antennas. So for my daughter, once I finally figured this out, because I mentioned I had bought her a laptop for Christmas, and she, of course, is sitting there with it on her lap. Notice in the ads, though, they're not calling them laptops anymore. They're calling them tablets. Put it on a table. Don't put it, but they didn't tell you that, right? So I brought this home, and I told my daughter to hook it up. She's a teenager rolling her eyeballs at me, and I said, come on, try it. So she plugs it in, and she turns off the antennas in her cell phone, in her iPhone. And she said, wow, this is so much faster. And I said, all right. And then I could see the wheels turning, and she went, so if I'm accessing the internet through an Ethernet cable through this adapter into my phone, and I've turned off the wireless, does that mean it's not eating into my data plan? And I said, that's right. And that's where it hit a teenager, because if she goes over budget, she has to pay out of pocket, right? So that's what sold my teenager on this. There are also pluggable devices for other kinds of phones, the Androids, but you need to check because some operating systems support it, some don't. So there are solutions out there, but more wireless is not the solution. Until the industry can make biologically safe technology that's mobile, and I've heard that in China, like their equivalent of MIT, there are some promising things that are using non-particulate signaling to carry the data. So we might get there one day, but for today we should absolutely not be investing in more wireless technology for ourselves, and we should certainly be speaking with our community leaders to make sure that they're not allowing any kind of toxic infrastructure here. So for our communities, I got way in over my head on this. I thought I was doing the good thing by bringing this technology into our schools, and when I started investigating, I saw so much science that I thought, oh, I'm never going to be able to keep this straight. So being a tech writer, I just built myself a very simple research repository, no bells, no whistles, but it's online. And I have a page, it's called Understanding EMFs, and I built a page for 5G and the Internet of Things that'll talk you through what the issue is, what the science is, what the industry's up to. And I also have another one on cell towers. So the cell tower studies say that we have done science and we have seen that within a quarter mile of a cell tower, we're seeing health effects. So you should not have a cell tower within a quarter mile of where people are, homes, schools, offices, playgrounds, hospitals, senior centers, quarter mile distance. And if you have vulnerable subpopulations, a half a mile. And you'll notice that the industry has encroached closer and closer, and those 3G and 4G antennas are now on top of medical buildings. They're putting up cell towers on school grounds, and it's just unconscionable knowing what the peer-reviewed science is. So, I know it's an awful lot to get your head around, and I tell people, freak out for 10 minutes as you leave here tonight, and you notice on your drive home, when you get into your home, when you get into your car, just where the wireless signals are. And then have an uh-oh moment, and then say, but you know what, there are solutions. And we are way ahead of where we were in 2013 when I fell down the rabbit hole on this issue. This film, Generation Zapped, was released to the public this spring, and prior to public release, it was screened in more than a dozen libraries throughout Massachusetts. We had a screening in June at the State House. Senator Sears sponsored that. And this summer, I was invited to go down to the NIH and form a technology panel in a Health in Buildings Roundtable conference. So these are all the people who are looking at how do we get back to as near a natural state in the built environment as we can. We had urban planners, we had the CDC, we had the NIH, we had architects and all sorts of people who care about what goes on in our buildings. And we ran this on a continuous loop down at the NIH. So 74 minutes, it's now widely available, and you can go watch it tonight if you want. But you'll hear directly from the actual scientific experts, the doctors from all over the world. And then on this journey, I have had the privilege of connecting with Brett and Lynn West out of the United Kingdom, and Brett is a technologist today whose job was to bring in and design the wireless systems for these really large construction projects in the UK. As a younger man in South Africa, he had been an EMT, and he had this medical background, and somehow that notice, the public position statement from the American Academy of Environmental Medicine came across his desk, and he said, what? They're recommending that we only hardwire our schools and get the Wi-Fi out? So he did the deep dive and thought, gosh, this is horrible. Let me start a side business. I'll go out and help people remediate because I know the technology and I can make it safe for them. But then he quickly learned you can't remediate because nobody has any idea the issue even exists. So Brett West realized you have to have the education first. So that's why I'm pleased to be here tonight to help with you with that education. And he reached out to this Dr. Deborah Davis of the Environmental Health Trust and said, could I please have your permission to reference your nonprofit in these little courses that we're building to distill the science, explain the risks, show what other countries are already doing, because we are way behind the 8 ball on this. And then give people a tip sheet that says, here's what you do. First of all, hardwire everything you can. And when you're on the go, keep your devices in airplane mode unless you actually have to be sending and receiving data. So what I do, I have a cell phone, but by rule, it's in airplane mode. If I think somebody's looking for me, I'll set it away from my body, turn it on, let it download data, and then I put it right back in airplane mode, pick it up, read my texts and emails, compose my responses, set it away from my body, put it back in active mode, send, receive, 2 seconds later, back in airplane mode. And I have reduced my exposure in the 90th percentile, right? So we are very fortunate that there are 2 courses online today for literally, you can take the Schools and Families course for less than the cost of a movie ticket, and you can take a corporate induction safety course for about $25 that teaches not only the health risks but the legal risks in the work environment. And we have to charge the fee to keep all of our operating expenses going because we have to hire developers to build the internet, to build the course engine and stuff. But we also have a Robin Hood model. If there's a socially responsible business partner in the community that would like to license the wireless education courses, once they do that, we will let them designate a local school and we will give the training to the local schools. So if anybody's interested in doing that, we would be honored to help you with that. So lots of great ways to learn, but we should definitely be working toward hardwired technology that's safe, that's more affordable, it's more sustainable, and it's a lot better for our communities. No more wireless if we can help it. Okay. Thank you. May I answer any questions? Thanks.